Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Parish and Pub. I'm Stephen Brannon. Today I wanted to talk about the concept of the centralized meeting place of the transcendent, the place where the community meets the divine. This is, of course, the parish part of the Parish and Pub model, as I laid it out in the first episode of this channel. But the parish at the center of a town wasn't the first iteration of this concept. It wasn't a new idea. This goes way, way back, possibly to the very foundations of the first human civilizations. So, come with me on a journey across time and space to unlock the mysteries of the stairway to heaven, the divine mountain, the portal of paradise, the sanctum, sanctorum. I'm showing this painting of the Garden of Eden by Thomas Cole, not so much because of the garden imagery, but because of the mountain imagery. It's not as commonly known today, but Eden, in scripture and tradition, has always been understood as a mountain, from which four rivers flowed downward and out into the world. In Ezekiel 28, Eden is described both as the garden of God and the mountain of God. Why is this important? Well, because it corresponds with a human intuition that if we lowly, earthbound humans were to be able to encounter, meet, commune with God or the gods, whose domain has always been understood to be in the heavens, then it would have to be on a high place where the earth rose up to meet the heavens, where they could overlap. Dante knew this and shaped his Purgatorio as the mountain ascent to Eden. And this was clearly the logic in the story of the Tower of Babel, where humans wanted access to the divine and so built for themselves an artificial high place. This is almost certainly a story from the Hebrew perspective of the great ziggurat of Babylon. But beyond Babylon, all the great Mesopotamian city-states had their own ziggurats, and these were all essentially just artificial mountains, since there weren't an abundance of high places in the vast plains of Mesopotamia. Now, why go to all the trouble of building your own mountain if there wasn't a deeply ingrained intuition and understanding that a mountain, a high place, was the most sensible way of interacting with the divine, especially with the high gods and goddesses, the really important, really powerful gods and goddesses, not the little paltry gods and daemons and spirits that you could call on from your hearth or rooftop or local nearby shrine. The big gods you could build a civilization around, had to be met where you touched the sky. In the rainforests of Central and South America, the civilizations organized enough to pull this off had the same intuition and did the same thing. But these access points, either natural or man-made, in addition to being high up, or perhaps partly because of that, were also hidden, veiled from most, either by their sheer physical inaccessibility or by an enclosed temple. In the case of Eden, the garden had different levels or tiers. It certainly had an outer boundary, as the man and woman discovered when they were exiled from it, but it also had a midst, a middle, the innermost place, where the tree of the knowledge of good and evil had been planted. If the Garden of Eden is also a mountain, then its middle, we should naturally understand, would be also its top, its highest point. On the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the temple was on top. It was on the top of Mount Sinai that Moses encountered God behind a veil of thick cloud and darkness, where only he himself would see the unveiled heavenly reality of God's dwelling. When he came back down the mountain, the Hebrews built a copy of this heavenly reality in portable form, the tabernacle, which itself had various tiers or zones, degrees of holiness, with the holiest of holies, the sanctum sanctorum, at its deepest level. So, prohibited either by the physical heights or by the carefully guarded boundaries in a temple complex, the innermost meeting place of the divine was essentially off limits to all but a representative few. When a civilization looks to a divine power for protection, resources, a sense of identity, it has tended to single out a select few of its members to be mediators between them and that power. Actually, when a civilization looks to any kind of power for something, even if it's secular, political, economic, martial, it does the same thing. It's the most natural thing in the world for a large group to have, either by election, birth, lot, or special training, some smaller representative group to stand in the gap and to advocate for the larger group. For example, we in America don't hold nationwide voting referenda every time we need to come up with some new piece of legislation. We elect representatives to do that for us, hopefully with our best interests in mind. When this is happening in the context of a divine power, what emerges is a representative priestly group. Not only would it be impractical for every single person in a society to individually ascend to the heaven and earth overlap spot on a regular basis, but it could be inappropriate too, unseemly, and possibly dangerous, as we hear from Exodus 20. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, "You speak with us, and we will listen, but let not God speak with us, lest we die." So there were some reasons to choose specialists as representatives to mediate between the people and the political or the divine powers. There was a why to the priesthood, but what was the what? What did priests actually do? Besides taking the risk just to go and be in proximity to deity, priests almost universally did two things: intercede and sacrifice. The interceding part is pretty straightforward. They would ask the gods for favors, for benefits, for good harvests, for protection, for victory in battle, for glory. And not just for themselves, obviously, but for the people, though that might require from the people some special payment so that the priests, or at least the most effective or convincing priests, could enrich themselves quite a bit through their office. And this transactional attitude actually carried into the sacrificial system itself, as the sacrifices themselves seem to have essentially been transactional payments to the gods, an economy of literally feeding the gods with food and drink offerings, trying to curry their favor through these things, probably with a healthy dose of poetic flattery thrown in. Because by all accounts, the gods could be fickle. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Utnapishtim made a sacrifice, he says the gods swarmed around it like flies. Even though no one records witnessing the gods actually eating the sacrifices in a visible, tangible way, the Greeks said that their gods subsisted on the immortal food ambrosia. The gods, nevertheless, enjoyed the smell of burnt offerings and somehow felt a desire for, even a need for, sacrifices. But knowing this, the humans could be fickle as well. And if a particular city's god had failed to lift a drought or to defend from one too many attacks, then searching after more propitious gods and placating them instead might be a reasonable course of action. Though throughout the ancient world there was a general and widespread belief in the gods and in the efficacy of the sacrificial system, there were, every now and then, here and there, seers and movements that recognized something like a reality behind and beyond the gods, something more truly real, truly existent, something more honest and reasonable than the fickle gods, something that touched on truth, virtue, the deep down reality that wisdom could put one in touch with. These lovers of wisdom, philosophers, generally didn't disrupt too much the way of things and did their pious duty, though every now and then some of them did get in trouble. See Socrates, for example. Mostly they just existed parallel to the gods and their sacrifices. Hinduism, for example, doesn't really merge the two strands, C.S. Lewis observed. Unredeemable savage religion goes on in the village, the hermit philosophizes in the forest, and neither really interfaces with the other. But among one family of Semitic tribes in the Levant called the Hebrews, the concerns of the philosophers seems to have translated into the divine economy of worship and sacrifice. There are certainly things in the records of the Hebrews that make theirs seem like all the other systems, like saying their God smelled the pleasing aroma of Noah's sacrifice after the flood, just like the gods had flocked to the smell of Utnapishtim's sacrifice after the flood. But other places in their writings make it abundantly clear that their God was not interested in animal sacrifices, but rather in the state of one's heart and one's ethical and moral behaviors. The poet King David, singing to Yahweh his God, said, "For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." And these are the words of Yahweh according to the prophet Hosea. "For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." The Hebrews also began discerning that their God, unlike the gods of Egypt or of the Canaanites or of the Babylonians, was singular in a special way, not just a sky father like Ea or a cloud-riding, monster-killing warrior like Baal, but a God whose reign extended all the way back behind the Chaos Kampf events that brought the cosmos out of the chaotic proto-matter of the pre-cosmic void. His nature, they eventually understood, was basically existence itself. Even his name, Yahweh, just means he who is. So what was the point of a sacrificial system among the Hebrews if their God neither subsisted on nor desired their sacrifices and burnt offerings? The answer seems to go all the way back to their first formative story of that man and woman in Eden, in the first heaven and earth overlap spot, where the first priestly representative of all humanity, whose very name, Adam, just means human, this man failed at the only sacrifice ever asked of him, outwardly just to abstain from a single fruit tree. Inwardly, though, it was a test of self-denial, the giving up of oneself, putting one's own interest and desires second to a higher principle, a better and more foundational good. This was the sacrifice asked of that first priest on that first divine mountain. At the formation of the relationship between the Hebrew people and their singular God, their prophet/priest Moses did sacrifice his own self-interest atop the divine mountain, Mount Sinai in this case, when he pleaded that Yahweh would take his life rather than destroy the rebellious, idolatrous, evil people at the bottom of the mountain. Yahweh didn't take Moses' life, by the way. When that Sinai meeting place became portable in the form of the tabernacle, all of the sacrifices of the Hebrews there were supposed to become visible signs, tangible demonstrations of their own personal sacrifices of self-interest, and communicate to them that the innocent lifeblood of their valuable livestock somehow stood in for or presented before the divine their own lifeblood. More importantly, they were supposed to live uprightly, all of them, and only by living rightly would their sacrifices mean anything. But for the Hebrews, like for all of their neighbors in the ancient world, their sacrifices quickly became transactional in their minds, and no longer meant what they were supposed to mean. As Yahweh said to his people through the mouth of Isaiah the prophet, "Bring no more vain offerings, they're an abomination. Instead, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." The seers and the wisdom lovers among the Hebrews knew that they, as a people, had failed to live up to their high calling to be a new Adam in a new Eden, interceding for mankind. Their priestly role as intercessors and offerers of sacrifice for the world failed. Or did it? In the fullness of time, a man from among the Hebrews, anointed for a special purpose, began teaching the people. This anointed one, Mashiach in Hebrew, Christos in Greek, by all accounts, and we have several of them, healed people, worked wonders, socialized with sinners and outcasts, and confounded the religious experts of his day by teaching in the strongest possible terms the true meaning and purpose of his people's relationship with Yahweh. And for all this, he was betrayed by those religious experts, betrayed by the justice arm of the supposedly indifferent state, betrayed by the very people that he healed and loved, and most painfully, betrayed by his own friends. He was put to death in the most painful, ignominious way ever devised by man, and he forgave them all to his last breath. Had he been merely a man, this alone would have made him the most remarkable man to have ever lived. But dozens and then hundreds of people then experienced him in a way that convinced them that not only had he overcome death somehow in a way that they had no easy category for, but also that he was in fact the very presence and person and image of their God Yahweh himself, his divine Son. The community of people who became devoted to this Christos, called Christians, understood him in his willing offering up of his own divine life to the wicked will and actions of his own dear creatures, his own brothers and sisters, in fact, according to the flesh, since he took on the same human flesh and birth and death as all the rest of them. His sacrifice was actually the ultimate sacrifice, summing up and superseding all other sacrifices humans had ever tried making, sacrifices in hopes of gaining divine blessing, sacrifices made in shame and recognition of sin, sacrifices made in thanksgiving for something, sacrifices made simply to express honor and reverence for the divine, and most of all, sacrifices of the will, of subordination, of the intentional letting go of self-interest and self-ownership. The sacrifice of Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, on that cross, was the sacrifice par excellence, the very type and reality of which all other sacrifices had been a shadow. What this meant now was that all other ritual sacrifices were moot, including the sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem, which had been the brick-and-mortar replacement for the desert tabernacle of the Hebrews, the place where the presence of Yahweh was sought after and entreated. It was the last great copy of the heavenly reality, the last great heaven and earth overlap spot. But when the ultimate, superseding sacrifice happened, the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews insists that Jesus, not with the blood of livestock, but with his own blood, entered the most holy place once and for all, as in the heavenly reality, not the copy temple in Jerusalem. And the biographers of Jesus relate how the veil in that temple was torn in two from top to bottom at the moment of his sacrifice, signifying the end of that place as the one heaven and earth overlap spot. This meant that heaven and earth overlap could now be anywhere. It's not that the temple was abolished so much as now that the temple could be anywhere that the sacrifice of Jesus was made present, which is precisely what Christians did when they celebrated the meal of bread and wine that Jesus told them was his body and blood, i.e., his sacrifice of himself. So that once-for-all sacrifice was remembered, reconstituted, made present again by the community of Jesus followers in their ritual meal that they called the Eucharist, Greek for Thanksgiving. The Jesus followers, with their Eucharistic liturgy, housed first in their own homes, swiftly converted the entire Roman Empire, and then the various pagan neighbors of that empire, setting up in the midst of their various local communities purpose-built houses for that liturgy of the ultimate sacrifice, making Eden, Mount Sinai, the Jerusalem temple present in the town and city centers wherever they lived. In a word, the village parish was the divine mountain, because God dwelt there sacramentally, which is just a word meaning where heaven and earth overlap. That was the power of the parish in the old model, a very real and tangible access point to the transcendent, reminding everyone when they caught a glimpse of the steeple or heard the bell ringing through the alleyways and out into the fields and forests outside the towns, that the transcendent was nearby, that their daily lives were being carried out in physical proximity to heaven, reminding them to live in accordance with the nature of that ultimate sacrifice, housed there at the literal center of their lives. This was the model that transformed the entire pagan world in a way that the Hebrews, with their tabernacle, could never have imagined. This is the model that formed Western culture and civilization from a conglomerate of various paganisms, classical or barbarian, into a cohesive culture of baptized penitents, bowing the knee at the name of a Jewish rabbi who they understood to be the transcendent reality behind the shadows of all their earlier mythologies and archetypes and sacrifices. The altar in the sanctuary of any of their local parishes or monasteries or cathedrals was the heaven and earth overlap place that enlivened and made coherent all of their daily lives and activities and efforts and strivings and goals and dreams. It's what built the West. It's what built us. Thanks for watching. Till next time.